Over 80% of the world's population is vaccinated against diphtheria, tetanus, polio, measles, and hepatitis B, some of the biggest infectious diseases. In some countries, vaccines are mandatory, and those who choose not to vaccinate are labelled as crazies. But in America, Australia, and the United Kingdom, there is a small but vocal community turning away from mass vaccinations and choosing natural immunity. People who choose not to vaccinate are often labelled as anti-vaxxers, but not all in the community are against them completely. I travelled to the United Kingdom to discover why parents choose to move away from traditional medicine. As long as vaccines have been around, there have been people who are against them, but over the past 30 years, media coverage and notoriety of the group has increased. Dr. Andrew Wakefield is often seen as the godfather of the anti-vaccination movement. He is credited with the 1998 report in the medical journal The Lancet, which links measles, mumps and rubella vaccinations with bowel disease and autism. When the report was released, the United Kingdom and America saw a noticeable drop in vaccinations in some regions. But in recent years, Dr. Wakefield's work has been found to be fraudulent and all claims linking autism to vaccinations dismissed. Even without Wakefield's work, the movement believes that the cons of vaccinating your child outweigh the pros. The cons can be anywhere from minor illness, like time off school, to more serious things like permanent disability. When speaking to various members of the anti-vaccination community, it became clear that their stories are very similar and their suspicions are shared. Joanna Carpsia-Jones was a young girl when she first realised that something wasn't right with her vaccinations. Since then, she has made it her mission to inform others about vaccinations. Joanna, her daughter and I met in a cafe just outside Nottingham in the United Kingdom. Joanna spoke of her first experience with vaccines and how that impacted on her life.
This one here, I was pregnant with you, I had a weird vaccine experience when I was 13 that made me suspicious of it, and I thought at the time, before I have kids, I'm going to look into this because this is weird. They were lining everyone up for TB vaccines at school, and they sat me down, gave me the vaccine, and then afterwards the man gave me this blue card that said side effects on it, and I thought, hang on, I didn't know there were any side effects, and you should have given me that card before you stuck me with the needle, because now if I get any side effects, I've got no choice. Do you know what I mean? I can't look at the card and say, actually, I'd rather not do that, because you've just injected me with that stuff. And I thought, well, that's just really unethical, because, I'm disabled. I knew from when I was tiny, if you have an operation or anything, you have the surgeon's risk and benefit speech before you have the surgery. Any medical treatment, they tell you this could go wrong and that could go wrong, and this is the reason why we think you should have it. And I thought no one did that with vaccines. They just tell you the side effects afterwards when it's tough, and you've just got to go away and hope you don't get them, So I thought, well, that's just odd and it's unethical, so I'm going to look into it. And then I had a massive reaction anyway and ended up sick for the next 11 years. So
that's awkward.
And then I was vegetarian as well. So when I got pregnant with my child, I just thought, I'm going to look into it and I'm going to make sure that there's no nasty ingredients in there. I'm going to find out exactly what a vaccine is. And I said to my husband, I'm going to look into this. He sort of looked at me like I was nuts. How could you even think about not vaccinating our baby? Are you crazy? And I just said, I want to look into it. I'm not saying I won't, just to give me time. And he was worried about tetanus and polio, thought she would die of one of those. So I just said, give me a year, till she's a year old, and if you still want to do them too, by the time she's 1, I'll do just the tetanus and just the polio, which you used to be able to do in the 90s. And so he said, all right. And then by the time we got to the end of the year, he said, if you ever vaccinate my daughter, I'm just going to divorce you, I'll kill you, you're not going to touch her with anything. That's how converted he was to not doing it. So, yeah. And then my daughter is now grown up, as you can see, and she's expecting her own, and you're not going to do it either, are you?
Joanna continued by saying that the lack of knowledge and information given out by the government is a major issue.
vaccine?
Well, I think that they're just covering it up, and parents don't know. Most parents don't know, still don't know, because they just don't tell you. And that's why I set up my group, because I tried to get the information. You know, go to the GP. He's sitting there behind the desk with his insert you get from the vaccine. I'm like, give that to me. I want to see it. He rips it in half, hands me one half. I'm like, no, the whole thing, please. He's like, this half is for the doctor. You won't understand it. I'm not stupid. You know, I went to school. I know how to read. Give me the other half of the insert, and he wouldn't. And no one would give me that information. And I went to the chemist in the end, and I said, pharmacist, go back, you know, print me all the inserts on the vaccines. And I rang up the manufacturers as well. They sent me the information when I asked them, even though they're the ones who make them. But the government didn't want to do it, and I can see why as soon as I read the ingredients.
So why do you think the government doesn't?
Because as soon as mothers see, you know, 49% thimerosal, formaldehyde, and just everything, monkey kidney tissue, that's a gross one, and MMR has got aborted fetal tissue in it, which is gross. From humans. I mean, seriously, they take bits of babies, what they've aborted. Sorry about this, I know you're pregnant and this is a bad subject at the moment, but they culture the viruses on it, and then you get trace amounts of human DNA from the fetus that goes into the vaccine that's then injected into the child.
Many other parents who choose not to vaccinate echo the lack of knowledge and information. They spoke of the difficulties discovering what is in the vaccines themselves. The United Kingdom has the advantage of a universal healthcare system with the National Health Service, or the NHS. The NHS is a one-stop shop for all things to do with vaccine information in the United Kingdom. A quick look around their website and you can find information about the scheduling, what vaccines you can get, and why vaccines are safe. There is just one page explaining the benefits and risk of vaccinations, but all side effects which aren't the standard swelling or redness around the injection site are listed as a 1 in a million possibility. Anna Watson and Helen Kimball-Brook are members of ARNICA and the European Forum for Vaccine Vigilance, or the EFVV. ARNICA is a parent support group which promotes natural health, and the EFVV is a collection of vaccine suspicious groups from around Europe. They hope to encourage a more non-biased and independent information network which can be readily available to the public. I met with Anna and Helen at a cafe just outside of London. Anna spoke about the frustration the group feels when a pro-vaccination rhetoric is continually pushed.
Because most TV companies are not interested, and sometimes they actually have a bit of a policy that comes down from the government that says if you do discuss vaccines, make sure that your conclusion is that they're safe and effective. And the BBC goes one step further, and they put challenging vaccines, they put in the same category as if you were going to challenge things like AIDS, global warming, the Holocaust. You know, they put us into a very extreme category and don't want to give much airtime, do they?
A common image used by the pro-vaccination groups is a graph explaining how the introductions of vaccines dramatically reduce the number of people suffering infectious disease. But Anna and Helen believe that there is more to this graph than meets the eye. They explain that if you widen the graph's parameters, it shows that infectious disease rates were falling long before vaccines were introduced.
In the sort of 1900, there were tens of thousands of deaths from measles, as there were from many, many diseases. And then they were going through the Industrial Revolution, so there were like cramped living conditions, poor nutrition, you know, no clean water, no antibiotics.
Sanitation, the sewerage system was a disaster.
And they also had two world wars at the beginning part of the century, and whenever you get war, you always get more disease. You know, not just the stress, but the lack of food, and you know, everyone's immunity is low.
Helen is a semi-retired homeopath who first got interested in vaccinations after seeing numerous children who were injured by vaccines. She also decided not to vaccinate her own children. She spoke to me about the risk of a live vaccination and how they can affect unvaccinated children and those who have compromised immune system. Live vaccinations are vaccines created by reducing the virulence of a pathogen but still keeping it alive. Basically, you receive a small amount of the virus live when receiving a vaccination. While a live vaccination usually means a lower dose which is more effective, it can still contribute to the feeling of being sick after a vaccination.
But this was when I thought, this isn't right, I just don't like this, so we opted out. But Cecilia went into school anyway, the day that they gave the vaccine. 10 days later, which is the incubation period for measles, she came down with measles because she picked it up from her classmates who were breathing droplets.
And it's called shedding. So the live vaccines, the virus actually sheds from your skin and your mucous membranes, so you can pass it on. So with the flu vaccine, it's a live vaccine for children in school, and they're doing mass vaccination of children now, starting last year. So every child has this live vaccine. If the child has an immune-compromised relative at home, they're told not to have it because it's accepted that they can spread it to somebody. When I rang up the Department of Health, they said, well, yeah, we know it's live, but you could be sitting on a bus, people could be having flu, so we're not really concerned about that. But yes, we would recommend that the immune-compromised aren't exposed unnecessarily to that. But what it means is you're making much more available more live viruses, and you actually could be keeping it alive. So something like measles could have been, who knows, could have been nearly gone, because when you get the disease, you 99% you won't get that disease again if you've had that proper disease. It's not going to come back again, and it also protects your children. So if you've had measles naturally, not being vaccinated, then you pass the immunity onto your child for that first year of life. So the reason why the MMR is done after a year is that there are some mums who are still have the antibodies given. They give the antibodies to the children, and the MMR doesn't work on them because they actually fight the virus that comes through the MMR. But sadly, they'll probably in the future they'll start bringing that forward, because nearly everybody, 90% of mums are being vaccinated, or even if they're not getting measles.
So they don't have the natural immunity to pass on.
So we were having this, this decline in disease, which could have been from all the things we mentioned about sanitation, but also a decline because they're passing on immunity to their children when they're at their most vulnerable.
I spoke to Anna again, this time at her home with fellow Arnica member Suzanne Azar. Suzanne has first-hand experience about the trauma a vaccine can cause when her child was injured following his early childhood vaccinations.
In 92 I got married, in 93 I had a child, and by 95 my son was not walking or talking anymore. So we were on a plane coming back from Beirut, and my son, I think, had convulsions. He was about 2. So an ambulance met us at the plane, and we were taken to a local hospital near Heathrow Airport. And there was a paediatrician who stabilised him, attended to him, and then took me to one side and started to ask me medical history. And he asked me a question that I didn't understand. He said, talk to me about his inoculations, and I didn't recognise the word inoculations. So I shook my head. And he said to me his vaccines, and I said, oh, he's had all his vaccines. Of course he has. And he actually shook his head, pulled me, but didn't pull me, but pulled the curtain, like in the A&E, pulled the curtain, lowered his voice and said to me, you need to ask your doctor for the paper that comes with the vaccines. This child should not have any more vaccines.
Suzanne identified with Joanna in the difficulties they both faced in learning what ingredients are actually in vaccines.
Finally wrote to Merck, who had, I think it was Merck, who my son's last vaccine was the MMR, which he'd had a year earlier, and then got this, I don't know how many pages, couldn't understand any of it, went back to my GP, and as she's reading it, she suddenly stopped. And she stopped at the word otitis media, which I didn't know what it meant. Otitis media basically means chronic ear infection. And what had happened with my son was his formal diagnosis was non-autistic regression. Essentially, he had glue ear. So they were saying to me that he needed to have grommets fitted. Now, grommets was something that were not common at the time. So I asked, as you do, and I was told that they would punch a hole into his eardrum and put in a tube to drain the inner ear. And apparently this would stop antibiotics, infections, because he'd had 11 doses of antibiotics in that 1 year. And I couldn't understand how, by breaching the eardrum, that it would stop infection, because, anyway, so I started reading about it and I wasn't convinced. We decided not to have the operation, and then I went to the library because I was really confused, didn't know what to do. Picked up a book by a doctor called Raymond Weil, an American doctor. And in the back of that book, he talked about homeopathy I'd never heard of, osteopathy I'd never heard of, blah, blah, blah. But he was an MD. And in the back of his book, he had resources. And among the resources were phone numbers for osteopathic council, blah, 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 in the UK. And that was really when I started down the path of trying to recover my son, because basically I realised then that there was nothing medical that we could do to make him better.
The Centre for Disease Control states that while some vaccines have substances like mercury, formaldehyde and aluminium, that they are at such low levels that they aren't harmful, but others tend to disagree. Suzanne, like many other parents in the United Kingdom whose children are affected by vaccine, they have little support services available. This is why parent groups are the face of the anti-vaccination movement. The UK government does have a one-off payment called the Vaccine Damages Payment, which can be given to you if you have been severely disabled as a result of a vaccination. It is a one-off payment of £120,000 tax-free. In order to qualify for this payment, you must be at least 60% disabled. You also need to be claiming for a child if they are over 2 years old and have been normally vaccinated before their 18th birthday. The process is long and the payouts are rare. Robert Fletcher had the controversial MMR vaccine, which is mumps, measles and rubella. As a child, he suffered a severe brain damage due to this vaccine. After 18 years of seeking a payment and denials from the Department of Health in the United Kingdom, Robert finally received £90,000. Ellen Berry McIntosh is another victim of vaccines. In 2010, Ellen was 12 years old and due to get the HPV or human papilloma virus vaccine at school. After receiving the first 2 doses of the vaccine, the once competitive swimmer's life was dramatically altered.
Well, it was 2011, I think. 2010. And we got the letters from school to have they called it the cancer vaccine. And that's all we knew it as. And had them done through school and just didn't feel right, felt like I had a bad virus or a cold. And then got the second one and my arm swelled up, but didn't think much of it. But then it just felt like virus after virus and it got pretty bad, but didn't, just assumed I was sick. But after that it just never felt like I got over it, and then things just kept getting worse from there. Like I had trouble catching my breath and my lips would go blue. And this, slowly, I'd get tremors in my hands and I was having trouble writing in class. And I had to stop swimming. I was getting very clumsy, I kept tripping over. And I was so tired all of the time, I just kept missing lots of school. And I did most of my schoolwork from home and then just came in for the exams.
I spoke to Ellen and her mother, Christina, at their home in Kent, in the United Kingdom. Ellen and her family only realised the link between her illness and the vaccine last year after reading a similar story.
Only about a year ago.
Okay. And what was the
We saw an article where a young girl, basically the exact same symptoms as me, well, more or less the same, and it was the same type of story, and she was an athlete and then she was sick. I can't remember her name because there's so many of them. And then Mum and Dad looked into it and then sat me down and they're like, this sounds really similar. Like the HPV vaccine, we've always said she had a bunch of vaccines. Well, she had the vaccines and then she got sick and it was a big hit to the immune system. We just didn't put it all together. From what I can remember, because I would have only been 12, 13, but I remember just, it felt like I kept getting colds all the time, so I didn't put it together and I always felt run down.
Ellen isn't the only girl to be injured after the HPV vaccination. Sandvax, an American organisation which has members in the United Kingdom, believes that around 44,000 girls have been injured due to the HPV vaccine, ranging from mild illness to disability and even death. Created in 2006 by Professor Ian Fraser in Australia, Gardasil or Cervix, which are their market names, intended to protect young women against several strains of HPV, some of which can cause cervical cancer. Christina and Ellen raised issue over how the research of the vaccine was conducted. Norma Erickson, president of Sandvax, who I spoke to over Skype, agreed with these concerns.
Yes, and not necessarily longer research, but better research, better conducted. We don't want to test one vaccine against another to prove that they're equally dangerous. We want vaccines tested against placebos so that we know what the risks are.
Like Joanna and Suzanne, Christina and Ellen weren't aware of any side effects before Ellen received the vaccines.
No, I didn't know there was side effects of vaccines, and I think there was a lot of stuff floating around. I knew at school that a lot of people were passing out because an ambulance had been called in, I'm sure, and I had a friend who passed out. But I didn't put it together. I just thought I got a virus or something afterwards. And when my arms swelled up, I just assumed, well, that happens sometimes. It must have hit the wrong spot. I don't remember actually we got given a letter to bring home to our parents.
Yes.
And which pretty much said the cancer vaccine on it.
Yeah.
And I think, to be honest, there was nothing in that information leaflet, and that leaflet they still give out because they've just gave it out last September, October to my younger daughter who hasn't had it. But it didn't say anything. It said if for any other information you had to research it yourself, and I never did research it, which is wrong, because now I believe everybody should research before they even think about it, to be perfectly honest. But
while the HPV vaccine protects girls against some sexually transmitted cancers, it doesn't mean that the girls, once sexually active, should not receive pap smears. I spoke to Christina about this and asked why a greater emphasis isn't put on women getting regular pap smears.
I don't know.
It's pharmaceutical companies. They're going to make money from this, and that's really, there's no other answer, is there? It boils down to money.
They're trying to sell a quick fix, and it just hasn't worked.
Ellen is now in her late teens and since becoming ill has developed a genetic disorder. Mum Christina believes that the vaccine triggered this, and because of the additional illness, they won't get compensation.
It's going to be very difficult for Ellen to get compensation, for us as a family to get compensation, because Ellen has now been diagnosed with the genetic condition, which I believe has been triggered by this. But there are, you're just not going to, and we've decided not to go down that route. That wouldn't be fair.
Really, I just want to pursue raising enough awareness that it doesn't happen to anyone else.
Despite the trauma the HPV vaccination has caused Ellen and her family, they don't describe themselves as anti-vaxxers. Rather, they are just anti-HPV.
I've always... I've had my children vaccinated. I've had, and my younger son, my only son, my son actually reacted to one of his first baby vaccines, but it was literally his skin raised and it was very swollen and so forth, and that was dealt with so professionally, and they decided it was the potassius, the one for whooping cough. They dropped it in his others, and all his other vaccinations were done separately. Didn't have to fight for anything. It was all dealt with absolutely fine, and he's gone through, and it was always a little bit because he's asthmatic, and he went through without having that vaccine after that first one because he did react to it, and that was dealt with absolutely fine. So I haven't got a problem.
Yeah.
That's why I didn't have a problem having Ellen vaccinated. I won't have any of my other children vaccinated given the HPV vaccine. What I now know,
Yes.
I certainly wouldn't be having them vaccinated with that. But, you know, when it comes to other vaccines, you have to rationalise, you have to,
You
know...
think of the pros and cons.
Absolutely. I'm not sure about Ellen, and I obviously will have to talk to Ellen's specialists when eventually Ellen gets in a place medically to be able to take up her place at university. I'm not sure about the meningitis vaccine, whether that would be a good idea on an already battered immune system, but obviously I will.
And you'd be able to look
speak
into
to-
that and
yeah.
consult doctors on that, because
Yeah.
we're aware of what can
Yeah.
happen.
Norma from Sandvax also shares this view. Norma on anti-vaxxers?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
None of the parents that are in this now are anti-vaccine. If they were, they wouldn't be where they're at.
There are a few organisations who are suspicious about vaccines, but are ruthless when telling you they aren't anti-vaxxers. I emailed a French organisation called the National League for Freedom of Vaccinations for a comment. After a lot of back and forth, the president, Jean-Pierre Affrut, he sent me a PDF with his comments. He voiced his concern over the lack of independent information, a concern that was brought up with everyone I spoke to. He said the parties concerned or their parents need an objective, impartial information, including the risk of the disease, the evaluation of the efficiency of the vaccines, and their side effects. There is this information available, but as previously mentioned, only on government health department websites. The Centre for Disease Control in America website goes as far as saying that anti-vaccination websites shouldn't be trusted as they aren't doctors. While this is a reasonable statement, there isn't any credible authority giving impartial advice. The European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control also sprouts a hostile opinion towards anti-vaccination websites. In an email correspondence with a press officer from the centre, she remarked that the internet is full of websites by anti-vaccination groups with misleading and usually wrong information. What can sometimes fuel this bias towards the vaccination suspicious community is a level of hostile passion the community sometimes displays. An Australian group called the Australian Vaccination Skeptics Network posted an image on their Facebook page with the words "forced penetration, really? No big deal if it's just a vaccination needle and he's a doctor. Do you really need control over your own choices?" The words were accompanied by a picture of a woman clearly in distress, with a man standing over her with his hand clamped over her mouth. The image caused an uproar in Australia, and the Facebook page has now disappeared. I asked Anna and Suzanne, who help run an active Facebook page for natural health and vaccine information, about their feelings on the post.
I mean, that sort of language is so counter.
And
I mean,
that's-
we have a
yeah.
lot of language against us, saying if you don't vaccinate, you're putting your child at risk, or you could be responsible for killing another child. I mean, that's really emotive language on the other side. But most of the vaccine groups that I know of would not enter that at all, because they're coming from a completely different place.
Suzanne and Ellen might never get compensation for the damage that vaccines have caused. Instead, they use their free time educating other parents and the community about the risk of vaccines. Unlike their Australian counterparts who liken vaccinating your child with rape, all of the people I have met in the United Kingdom were positive and rational in their views. Nothing like what I expected to find. Whether vaccinating your child is wrong or right, the level of bias towards this community is clear.